Gary, namaste, and thank you for being with us again. You were with us last year for a very nice roundtable discussion. And this year you have accepted to support this effort of the Yoga4Unity program to promote yoga in all its beauty, I would say, and everything that it has to offer. I'm really happy that we are picking this topic that is less discussed, and we've not talked about this topic yet today. So thank you for being with us.
As we say in the South, namaskaram, and it's an honor once again to be with you. I really feel, as I said, honored to support what you guys are doing in this work of spreading authentic yoga in the world today.
Thank you. We are going to take you back to the South, like you said. And so in our conversation, you have transported us to Madras, south of India, in the 1970s, I think, where you went there as a young man in search of something and discovered a very traditional school of yoga, the Deśikācar school, actually Krishnamacharya school, and you learned from his son, T.K.V. Deśikācar. So you went with a very specific search and discovered something else. So can you tell us about this?
Sure, and thank you. Yes, I feel very lucky that my life brought me as a young man. I was 19. And I had been an undergraduate. I had the first year of college was in 1972. And in 1972, I met, I was a student of religion. I encountered, first I studied Buddhism. The first semester in college, in my freshman year, I took a course on Buddhism. And there was a physical education requirement in the university, and I took a class on yoga. And I really just loved the yoga. So the next semester, I took a class in the university on Hinduism. This was in 1973, now in the second semester, and continued my study of yoga. And the woman who was the teacher was the wife of the chairman of the music department at Colgate University, who brought music students to India to study Carnatic music and Bharatanatyam. And so they were doing an annual study group to India. And I had a nice relationship with this woman who was teaching yoga. She was a student of Krishnamacharya. And they invited me to go to India with them. So in 1974, I arranged to do coursework at Madras University with a great teacher named V.A. Devasanapati. And he was a Shaivite Siddhanta scholar, mystic, practitioner, and at one point was chairman of the religious studies department at Madras University. So I arranged coursework. I was not a music student. They brought me with a group of music students, and I did coursework at Madras University with Devasanapati, and met Krishnamacharya and Deśikācar and became a student so Devasanapati was a Shaivite mystic, and Krishnamacharya was a Vaishnavite yogi, and of course his son Deśikācar. So I had that was my exposure to yoga, and began in 1974. And my interest in yoga was, I had encountered in that course on Hinduism, I had encountered Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. And I saw that yoga was a path to help us understand the meaning and purpose of life. As a young man, I wanted to know, what's it all about? I was studying religion as a kid, and much to the dismay of my parents, they couldn't understand why I would make that choice instead of studying accounting or something like that. But I was wanting to know what this was about in this life. And I saw Patanjali was offering teachings directly about that. So I came to India as a student of religion. And I had been a gymnast in high school. And in the phys ed department, I had studied asana with this Mary Lou Skelton, who was my first teacher, who was that student of Krishnamacharya. And I thought that was interesting. But my real interest was in understanding the nature of the mind and the path for transformation and freedom. And that's what brought me to India.
So that's your first visit. You came as a student of religion, or like now you're talking about Hinduism, but did you study other religions before? What was your upbringing?
Well, I was raised in a secular.
Yes.
Yeah. No, well, okay. So, I mean, I'll give you two kinds of answers to that question. I was raised in a secular American family. My ancestry on both my mom and dad's side came from Eastern Europe in the 1870s. So a long time ago, they came on my father's side from the Ukraine, on my mother's side from Lithuania, and they were Ashkenazi Jews who were fleeing pogroms. So they emigrated in different times to the United States, and there was generations of my family in Philadelphia, actually, which is where I was born and raised. And so there was no real religion in my home. I was exposed, of course, to the culture of Judaism, but my parents weren't practicing Jews at all in any serious way, just socially. But my interest in religion started as a young child, and so when I went to the university, I began as I said, my first course was in Buddhism, then Hinduism, but I also studied academically. Then I began to study Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, the Abrahamic traditions of Judaism, Islam, or Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And just I was a lifelong scholar as in the university. In fact, I continued through all the coursework for my PhD in religious studies. So it's been a lifelong journey, and the interest started since I was very young. And I said I would give you two answers. My teacher, Deśikācar, said to me 1 year, and this was probably in 1976, so I'd only spent a couple of years with him at that point. I met him in 74. And one day he just looked at me and he says, "Don't think you know what you know about yoga from what you learned from me." And I sort of shrugged and I said, "I don't know what you mean." And he said, "You're a brahmasta." And of course, I had just begun my study of Sanskrit, so I didn't realize fully what that meant. It kind of means fallen, like a fallen yogi. But basically what he meant was that he said, "You've been doing this lifetimes. You couldn't know what you know about yoga, from what you learned from me. You've already came in with a knowing that brought you to my father. He said, brought you to father, and now studying with me." So it's a bit of a mystery. It was very young. I was interested in understanding the meaning of life from a young age, and even about the meaning of death. And I used to ask my parents when I was under 10 about that, and kind of freak them out. So I sort of started out in this orientation really quite young.
Okay, so that's a very interesting entry to what we think yoga is. So as we were just discussing, yoga is very much associated with asanas, and suddenly you're talking about the meaning of life and what happens when we die, or this mystical approach. What was was it combined in the teachings that you got from Deśikācar? How does that come together in the study of yoga?
Well, I think that for me, and I think I may be somewhat different than some of my experience. I think with all of us who were close students of Deśikācar, we all have slightly different experiences with him. And I think that has to do with our own differences. Each one of us came from a different background. Most of his students were engineers, scientists, or business people. I don't think he had many students like me who were students of religion. So in my experience with him, we began sort of with a context that comes from Taittiriya Upanishad that relates to the Panchamaya model, popularly known as the Panchamaya Kosha model, the Annamaya, Pranamaya, Manomaya, Vijnanamaya, Anandamaya, sort of to lay out the sort of multidimensional nature of what it is to be a human being, and that yoga offers a path for understanding and integrating every dimension of who we are. And And, he said that usually in our methodology, we kind of move from gross to subtle. And, we did spend some time in the beginning, with asana and laying out the scope of our study, asana and pranayama. And he had a Western science education. So I would say that there's a way of thinking about asana and pranayama. This is compartmentalizing. It's not really the way it is, but thinking about asana in relation to our functional anatomy and pranayama in relation, well, to many things, including our physiology. And then the mind. And we used Patanjali as a structure for the study of the mind, asana as a structure for the study of the body, and pranayama was sort of like this mysterious link between the mind and the body and the spirit, the dimension of the spirit. And so we sort of laid out a study, and we just began to work through these different topics, sort of exploring the science of asana, exploring the science of pranayama, exploring the teachings of Patanjali, and that was through chanting, which was a surprise for me, because although I told you that I was raised in a secular American family, I was sent to Hebrew school as a young boy and went through what they call bar mitzvah. And that means that my parents picked a synagogue that was not one of the modern Reformed ones. It was actually not Orthodox, but it was what they called conservative. And maybe because it was it's even in encyclopedias, it's an unusual synagogue that was designed by this famous architect, Frank Lloyd Wright. So it looks like the Star of David. Anyway, so that's where they sent me, and so we chanted in Hebrew. So I had been exposed when I was younger, from 10 to 13, chanting Hebrew. And then I didn't know that there was a chanting component in yoga. Now I've learned, obviously, that it's one of the major practices. And so they taught me chanting, and they taught me from the beginning chanting Yoga Sutras, but also in their family sort of Gotra, which was Krishna Yajurveda, the Taittiriya Upanishad was part of the Svadhyayanam for their family. So I began learning to chant parts of the Taittiriya Upanishad along with, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And so they just sort of laid it out for me, and we just began working. And along the way, Deśikācar said that I should become a yoga teacher, and then in this sort of later in the mid-70s that I should become a yoga therapist, and they just trained me. And in fact, I told him that I was going to go to graduate school and get a PhD in religious studies, and he said, "You're too young to study religion. You should study medicine." And I asked him then, why should I study medicine? I want to, that's not my interest. He says, because in the future, you'll be bringing yoga therapy into the context of Western healthcare. And so although I did continue my study of religion, in fact, I didn't go to medical school. I started training myself in anatomy, physiology, pathology, so that I could do this work that he trained me to do with yoga therapy as well.
That's very interesting. I just want, there are many questions I want to ask you right now, but I just want to try to imagine what was your day. Did you practice any asana at all?
I practiced a lot of asana.
So were you doing asana in the morning, then pranayama, then in the evening you had the theory, the chanting? How is it?
So, I mean, are you asking me how my work with Deśikācar was, or on my own practice when I was learning?
Deśikācar.
Yeah, so when we studied asana, I practiced asana, we had sessions that were usually an hour and a half or something like that, sometimes 2 hours, sometimes less. And so I would go and in the beginning, and I would go through practice, and he would teach me practice, and he would look at my body and refine what I was doing. And when it was time to study pranayama, we would use some simple asana preparation with breath-centric asana, with breath adaptation, and then I would sit before him and practice pranayama. So usually there was a session on asana or on pranayama or on chanting, and then usually the study, the meaning of Yoga Sutras followed the chanting of Yoga Sutras. They were separate classes, but then he began, he would give me paces, he would say, 45-year-old engineer, 30-year-old young mother, and design sequences. He started training me in how to adapt and calibrate asana and pranayama to suit the needs of different kinds of individuals. So it was a combination of first, initially, the first years training me as a practitioner of asana pranayama and chanting, and then a little bit later meditation. I was in my early 20s when we began. And then training me to teach the science of teaching asana pranayama, chanting, meditation, and then later therapeutics. And towards the latter part of our work together, he said, it's time to go back. You're older now. It's time to share the more inner teachings, the more spiritual. In fact, one year he said to me, why are you holding back? And I didn't know what he meant. And he said, you're not sharing the inner teachings, the antaranga sadhana. And he said, you said I was too young. I responded, you said I was too young. He said, yeah, that was like 30 years ago. It's time for you. So it was like that. I hope I'm answering your question.
Yes, exactly. And so you actually started all the angas together. It was
yes,
not
in fact.
up to, yes.
I mean, I should add that all of my classes with him were private, one-on-one classes, except for textual study and some chanting. We did some of that privately, but also I was in groups, sometimes groups with other Westerners, Europeans principally, sometimes with his Indian students. I would sit in on those classes as well. Otherwise, it was private, because he said that, as an adult, the practice is for you. So he encouraged me to learn my own practice, not a group practice. So that was adapted and calibrated for my own needs. And yes, from the very beginning, the perspective was that yoga is an integrated science to work with every dimension of who we are. And, I remember like the angas, the way people grow, it's not that one limb grows and then another grows. They grow together, and he wanted this teaching to mature, to flower together, I think.
Thank you. That's a very nice, different way to learn yoga, and to explain it also, how all those components of yoga are important, and how we can study them together, or we can also have more inclination towards one. And I wanted to ask you that, was there one anga specifically that you preferred?
Svadhyaya and Ishvara Pranidhana for me were very important. And I love the way Patanjali does a little twist. If you remember his sutra, Svadhyayat Ishtadevata Samprayogaha, Samadhi Siddhi, Ishvara Pranidhana. So they kind of like, as you discover who you are, Ishvara, Ishtadevata appears, God appears. As you dedicate your life to that, then you master your mind. So for me, they were together. They were together. Asana was fun, but I was a gymnast in high school. For me, it was like fun. But then later, actually, as I got into it, in fact, when I did my master's degree, I created a PhD proposal that was accepted. That's another story, but it was on the relationship between, this was in the 1970s. Today, this makes more sense. It was on the relationship between health and religion. Mm-hmm. And I was going to use sound for a PhD proposal, but for the master's degree, I used yoga, and that the science of doing asana and pranayama for your own body sort of parallels the journey of the spirit to God, or to self-understanding, and maybe to God, depending upon your orientation. So for me, the process of asana practice, although, as I said, it was fun for me, it was integrated into the whole science.
So when you went back to the US, how did you start teaching? Could you start teaching everything that you had learned, and how did you transpose?
No, that's a fair question.
Mantras, all this to that Western culture.
Yeah. So when I first came back to teach, it was in 1978 was the first time I formally started teaching. And then I opened my first business in 1981. And I was principally teaching privates, because I was trained privately, not group classes. and I made myself available to people. I think that in my early years, a lot of the work was people who had injuries. A lot of my work was therapeutically oriented, and a lot of my students were either injured asana practitioners. There was a big Ashtanga yoga, a Patabi Joyce Ashtanga yoga community where I was living. So those people heard about me and they would come for help with their injuries. There was a lot. I lived in Hawaii for 30 years, so there was a lot of hula dancers. They're middle-aged Americans who moved to Hawaii and started studying hula, and they had hip and knee ankle problems. And my father's friends who were golfers, and they had sacrum issues. So my early years was private, mostly with structural issues. But as I grew and matured, people started bringing other issues to me. So, physiological conditions, sleep issues, depression, emotional issues. So just slowly over, I think the first decade of my teaching was all one-on-one. And my business back then was called Maui Yoga Therapy, because I lived on Maui. And so it was just a therapeutic practice. And then over time, Deśikācar said I should start training teachers and therapists, which I then began to do in the mid 1980s. I began some teacher training a little bit earlier, but by the late 1980s, I was also training yoga therapists. And then, I got invited to the United States from Hawaii, to do presentations and conferences and workshops. And that's how my career sort of launched. Just because students of yoga who knew about Deśikācar then found out about me, and like Rama Vernon was an important American who started some of the Yoga Journal conferences and Unity in Yoga, which predated Yoga Journal. So they knew me. I met actually her, Rama Jyoti Vernon, who's passed now, at Zinal. Gerard Blitz from the Club Mediterranean, he was a student of Krishnamacharya and started the European Union of Naturally Federated Yoga Teachers. And so I was invited to those meetings early on in the 1980s, and meeting those Americans that were connected. And that's how my career started. They started inviting me to come and do this and that conference or event or workshop.
So this aspect of the spiritual aspect of yoga, I first wanted to ask you, this question that I had about Sankhya and yoga. Sankhya, so we say the sisters darshana, one being more about the philosophy of it and the other one being the practice of it. But there is a big difference between one and the other, the idea of Ishvar. So would you say, my question was, would you say that yoga goes beyond Sankhya? How is it?
Yeah, so you used the phrase Nastika, and I did want to say that I think that's not, and forgive me, but I do have decades of Sanskrit study, academic training, and training in India.
Yes.
Which is I don't know that really means anything, but I think that yoga, Sankhya and yoga are both astika systems, not nastika. Sankhya is not a nastika system. You can say that Sankhya is a non-theistic system.
Yes.
And even in Patanjali's presentation, and I'll answer your question in a moment more directly, but even in Sankhya's presentation, Sankhya is not doing theology. So he's talking about Ishvara from the point of view of the impact of faith in Shraddha, in Ishvara, on the human mind. Mm-hmm. He's not doing the work of theology. So Sankhya and yoga are both astika systems. Nastika systems are Buddhism, Jainism, Charavakan, other traditions that reject the revelatory status of they reject Shruti. They reject the idea that there's revealed scripture. That's the technical understanding of Nastika. So that's that idea. So Sankhya and yoga are paired, and they are both under the umbrella, let's say, of Vedic revelation. They accept Shruti. The way I would answer this question is that there's a difference between philosophical language and symbolic language. And just to make it simple as a way of discussing it, for me, philosophical language is the language of the mind,
Mhm.
and symbolic language is the language of the heart. It's the language of faith. So, both Kapila and even you could argue Patanjali are not doing theology. Patanjali is talking about faith, Shraddha, but from the perspective of its effect on the transformation of the mind. His presentation is fundamentally about the transformation of mind. And so for me, the way I think about it philosophically is that the difference between Sankhya and theology it's more an epistemological discussion, not an ontological discussion. It means it's more about the philosophy of knowing, how we know and come to an understanding, than the philosophy of being. So I think ultimately there's not a conflict between. I know the Orthodox Hindus rejected even Patanjali's Yoga Darshanam because it didn't talk about Ishvar as creator. He doesn't present Ishvar as creator. But of course, my teacher, the Krishnamacharya, was an Orthodox Vaishnavite. He was a bhakta. He was a devotee, and so everything that he taught from Patanjali was from that perspective, and even Sankhya.
Uh-huh.
He
Okay.
even taught Sankhya from that perspective. So Sankhya is just, I don't find that there's a difference. There's a difference, but I think it's more a philosophy of knowing and how to describe everything, and that the religious language, the spiritual language, is the language of the heart. It's symbolism. And
Yes.
symbolism expresses something that can't be expressed in rational, discursive, philosophical language. It's more experiential.
Yeah. I think
It's
you
a language of faith, if that makes sense to you.
very clear, very simple answer. Thank you. It's
It's important, right? Because people, especially in the West, and well, in the world in general, there's a lot of cross-cultural misunderstanding and conflict that arises from that misunderstanding because we use different symbols to express the human experience. And
so
then if people become idolatrous about, to use a Western term, idolatrous about their symbols, they're missing the point.
mm,
And
so
as a student of religion, I'm very alert to not being superficial and saying they're all the same. They're not all the same, but the human journey. I love the image that I once read from a book written by Swami Rama. Swami Rama, and he was talking about when you're climbing up the mountain, you may be on the path that you think is a direct path to get up there, but when you get to the top, you can see people are coming from other paths.
mm,
There's different, and so from where we are not awakened, they may look like differences. From the perspective of the traditional awakened beings, those differences are not relevant anymore.
yes. So using different symbolism in your work as a therapist, how is this aspect of faith uh, important? Maybe in the way you help, your patients.
Yeah.
Like, do you use that? Is it
Oh,
important? How
absolutely.
you in the
I mean,
process?
it all depends, of course. It
Yes.
all depends upon who's coming, why they're there, what their issues are, their concerns. But even at a more simplistic level, for yoga sadhana to be effective, they have to practice. For them to practice, they have to have faith in the efficacy of the practice, in their own potential to heal. So even if it's not a theologically oriented faith, just the process of recognizing that you have pain, and even if it's simple like structural issues, and you do something by yourself and the pain changes, it inspires the practitioner that they can actually affect change in their lives. And that inspires not only faith in me as someone who can help them learn to do it, but faith in the process and in their own ability to affect change in their own lives. So that's sort of the initiation of the discussion of faith. When people are coming to me that are having more deeper psycho-emotional issues, I ask them to reflect on what brings them joy and happiness. and then that becomes a sort of a doorway to enter the discussion of faith. People often are disconnected in our Western culture, and I know that you're in India now, so it's maybe different there, but I believe it's happening in India as well. From the last time that I taught in India, that was around 2012 in New Delhi. I was like amazed when I was there. I felt like I might as well be in the United States in terms of the yoga teachers that I was teaching in Indian yoga teachers disconnect from the authentic tradition. So I feel like in our culture, and I think in the modern world, even in India, there's a disconnect from the spiritual roots, and people are in a crisis of faith. And so I think our work, to help people understand the power of faith in their own healing and transformation is important. And how we do it, depends upon how I do it with an individual, depends upon their background, obviously. Some Americans, I help them rediscover. Many students of mine have reconnected to their ancestral heritage, their Catholic faith or their Jewish faith. And others actually are very comfortable. There are a lot of American yoga type interested people who have made that connection to Buddhism. And so besides those who go back to their Catholic or Jewish faith, Buddhists, and then some are working with, like as you see behind me, the symbolism that flows through the lineage I was initiated in. It works for them. And so it just depends. You have to find what their issues are and what symbols speak to their heart that can help them feel support, feel connection, find sources of joy and nourishment that aren't contingent on things going a certain way. I mean, I think the whole journey of yoga is really to become rooted in our true nature. As our tradition says, Sat Chit Ananda, the unchanging source of pure awareness, Purusha or Atman. That's what yoga is fundamentally about, I think, and that's a spiritual journey.
So finally, the two things you came in the 70s, being a student in religion and then learning about yoga, has really helped you to become who you are and how you teach yoga right now. Because I'm guessing that your knowledge about all the religions that you have studied, they also must help you to connect to the different background.
Deśikācar wanted me to study anatomy and physiology.
Yeah.
And I did. I didn't become a doctor, but so that I can work with people that are suffering. Because suffering, I think what I've noticed in my own experience, like I came in as a child with a passion to know, a passion for truth, what's really true. And I have had students who have that passion. They have no real major problem. They just want to know. They want to figure it out. But the majority of people that make progress in yoga usually are coming because they have pain at some level, pain and suffering. So pain and suffering is a doorway. So if I understood, Deśikācar helped me understand that if I understand anatomy and physiology and psychology and the spiritual dimension of life, I can work with anybody who comes who's suffering at any level and help them begin to relieve their suffering and then awaken to the journey, the deeper journey of yoga. So learning anatomy and physiology was very helpful, but he encouraged me to continue my study of world religions because, people can come to you from different faiths. You need to be able to speak the language of their faith to help them make deeper connections. And although a lot of the clients that I work with in nowadays are secular, they're not connected to religious traditions. Most of them have a religious background in their childhood. So knowing all of this, anatomy, physiology, psychology, and the spiritual traditions of the world are all helpful for me to meet somebody where they are when they come to see me and find a path for them to continue their inner journey.
So this is such a vast learning, such a vast domain compared to, the practice of asanas that unfortunately, yoga is very much reduced to that through social media and even education all over the world. And look at where we went today with you, from chanting to religion to, of course, anatomy, physiology, and spirituality. I have one more question from something that you were telling us is, in your own practice, I think if I understood well, you were telling that to understand the student, you yourself use meditation to understand how you're going to offer support or practice. Did I understand correctly?
You did. I don't talk much about that in public, but it's fine. So, like, I met Deśikācar when I was 19, and Krishnamacharya actually, in 1974. So somebody can do the math, right? I'm 68, so I'm not a spring chicken, as we say in America anymore. I'm not. So my way of working has changed over many decades. And where I am now in my work with individuals is that I only see, it used to be that I could see 3 people a day, 5 days a week. But now I see one person for 3 weeks and I don't see anyone else. It doesn't mean I'm not doing other things, I am doing other things, but I only work with one person at a time. So that we spend an hour and a half perhaps together. And then I have the rest of the day or the night, where I can just reflect deeply on them. For me, it's easy for me to work with someone with structural problems. I can see it very quickly because I've been doing it for 4 decades. And helping someone, I got a call from a friend of mine, used to be a friend that I hadn't seen in a long time when I lived in Maui, who's, they're telling him he needs a hip replacement surgery and he's got pain. And I just said, let's meet on Zoom. And he sent me a text the other day. He said, God, that hour, it's changed I don't have pain. So I learned from a master. Deśikācar was a master of this. But when I'm working with someone on an inner practice, that I take a tremendous amount of respect for. It takes more time. So when I have what happens when we're together, and then I just leave space to reflect on them, to wait for inspiration. It doesn't come from me. It comes from them. Sometimes I don't know until like at 3 o'clock in the morning and I wake up with an insight for them. And it's really true that I really usually don't know until I know. And then it's something that I receive. I don't want to sound strange, but when you're working with inner work, you're guided by their spirit, not by your. It's not about me. Krishnamacharya used to always say, the teaching is not about the teacher. It's not for the teacher. We learn from teaching, of course, but the teaching is for the student. And so my job is to be almost spacious inside so that I can be open to receive the guidance that I need to be able to help them at this inner level. And so that's it's a kind of meditative process. Is that making sense?
Yes.
But it's a luxury, that I can just see one person for 2 or 3 weeks.
Yes.
not anyone else.
Yes, I understand that. But that really takes this dimension of creating a safe space to another level.
Interesting.
So I think we're going to stop here for the interview. I want to thank you very much. I'm sure people would have a lot of questions just listening to you. I hope they can find a way, to connect with you. Also, we'll have all this, in your in the video in the description, because learning. You already given some insights in a very short time that I think will help yoga teachers, yoga practitioners to understand what yoga can bring and how it can be transformative in their journey. And I want to thank you again. for T.K.V.
You know, it's an honor again. Let me say thank you very much. For me, it's my svadharma to share this gift that I've received from the ancients and through Krishnamacharya and Deśikācar. So I'm always happy to share through your channel, your people, and I wish you all well. I just want to remind everyone that, you know, Krishnamacharya's teaching is that it's an integrated science. The integrated practice works with every dimension, you know, and it's the journey of life until, let me say one last thing. I mentioned it to you once before. When I was in my 20s, Deśikācar told me if I want to know the real purpose of yoga, it's preparation for the moment of death. And then there's a whole story. He explained why, and you know that when we die, it's not over. And he talked about Hiranyakasipu and Narayana, and I won't go into that story now. But it's very interesting to reflect on the meaning and purpose of life. And yoga is a process to help us uncover, discover, and prepare, fulfill, to find that fulfillment before we reach the end of our journey. So it's always an honor.
Thank you
Thank you
so much.